Well, I'm in the car on my way to the Northern Territory Supreme Court to listen to the summing up arguments of the defence and the prosecution of Constable Rolfe, who was charged with the murder of Kumanjai Walker in an Indigenous community. And I'm having a slow day at work and opened up the calendar a bit so I can come along and partake of our wonderful democracy and see how the third estate is going. I don't know if it's the third. One of the pillars of democracy, the justice system. It's a trial by jury, and it's been going on for some time. And it was the shooting of an Indigenous man in his home 3 times. The first shot disabled him, and the other constable, the other police officer, was on top of Kumanjai when the shooter, the defendant, more or less reached around to the side and shot him twice more. Shot Mr. Walker twice more. And the police officer who's been charged, Constable Rolfe, is an ex-military man who served for the Australian Defence Force in the wars in Afghanistan. So quite possibly somebody with post-traumatic stress disorder already, but definitely somebody who's been trained to go in and kill the enemy. And so lots of questions have been raised about the appropriateness of the strategy and the planning and the execution, pardon the pun, no pun intended, of the arrest of Kumanjai Walker. So it should be an interesting summing up, and it should be an interesting judgment when the judgment finally comes down, which will probably be in a few weeks or months. I don't know. Maybe the judge will get onto it quickly because it's such a strong public interest issue. But yesterday we had another shooting of an Indigenous man in Palmerston, up here in Darwin, or the satellite city Palmerston, near Darwin, and has its own jurisdiction, its own council. But the NT police arrived and shot a young Aboriginal man in the suburbs, which is really bad timing. We've got some real problems here in the Northern Territory with the way Indigenous people are perceived by authorities, by health, by the police, and how they're treated as a result of those perceptions. And there seems to be a kind of unconscious or even conscious perception that if there's adverse happenings, bad things happening to Indigenous people, it doesn't really matter that as much. There's a sort of a sense, oh look, they're all sick anyway, so they can wait, and then they die, and yeah, that's right. They've got a low death, so that the expectations, the life expectancy is literally a lot less than non-Aboriginal, non-Indigenous people, and there are even programs called Closing the Gap. It's about 14-year gap for life expectancy on an average, and so there's just lots of terrible institutional discrimination, and institutional inequities in the way people are treated based on whether or not they're Aboriginal, and there are lots of reasons for that. It's not just plain and simple straight out racism. It's fairly nuanced and convoluted, but it certainly needs to be addressed. And I don't think it's helpful to be either extremely angry and shouting at white people for being racist, because I think that just makes it worse, and I don't think it helps to just explain it away either. There's definitely some complex issues that need to be addressed, and they're layered, and they're very, very embroiled issues. So these are tight knots, and you pull on any string in the knot and it's only going to get tighter. So there's a lot of airing out and loosening up that needs to happen before we can fix these problems, and no one can swoop in like they tried to do in the so-called intervention, send the army in. Four Corners had a show on TV, the Australian Broadcasting Commission's television investigative journalism. There's still a bit of it around. They spent a long time doing a story about North Australian community, I think it was in Queensland. The services kind of interlink when you talk about health services and flying doctors and people having to travel 800 kilometres to get medical help, and children dying of rheumatic heart disease, which is basically caused by strep infections, which is a sort of common sore throat in other communities. There's a sort of a numbness or an acceptance or a frog in the pot syndrome of accepting intolerable third world health outcomes, including death, chronic heart disease as a result of treatable strep bacterial infections. And then when the people have the chronic diseases, there's sort of an acceptance of really poor outcomes and poor treatment, and people falling through the gaps even when they've been diagnosed by cardiologists and prescribed proper follow-up care with the community health, and to be put on a list for cardiac surgery, and then being sent home with a Panadol when they presented at the local hospital or community medical centre. So, it's easy to think, oh, these white people hate these Aboriginal people and they're just letting them die. But I think it's a little more complicated than that. Resourcing has something to do with it. The reason the hospitals are locked and they hand out Panadols through cages is, I guess, the staff are in fear. And I guess there are some precedents to why they're in fear. And there are precedents to why people are angry and becoming fearsome. So the shit is really hitting the fan, but it's been hitting the fan for a number of decades now, and I don't know how much longer it can go on. But anyway, I'm off to the Supreme Court to see about this police officer who was a soldier, who went in and behaved like a soldier and killed an Aboriginal man. And it's now up to the judge, having heard all the witnesses and being interviewed and cross-examined, and the summing up of the defence and the prosecution is occurring today. The prosecution was doing its final, I think they were doing the final cross-examination or something, and the summing up may have begun already. The whole thing started at 10 a.m. and it's now 11:06, so I've got to find a car park and Bob's your uncle. So yeah, hopefully some of the complexities of all of this will be discussed in the summing up. We're going to get two really strong arguments for why A, he should be convicted of murder, and B, why he should be acquitted. And he may end up going down for manslaughter or wrongful death. So it's going to be, yeah, interesting. And I'm really interested in how the law is handling this, because without the law we have mayhem, and the judge has to be have as much equanimity as possible. He has to be impartial. That's why they're there, and weigh it up with reason. So more power to the judge. Gotta go. Traffic. It's a rarity, and I'm in the city and we have traffic. Bye. Here I am at the Northern Territory Supreme Court, waiting outside for the Constable Rolfe, Commonwealth versus Constable Rolfe, over the Kumanjai Walker shooting. As people are coming back from lunch, the morning was the prosecutor making their case, and we're about to hear from the defence. Here we have Constable Rolfe and his supporters coming to the Supreme Court of the NT, coming back for the final summation before the jury gets to make its decision. Coming back from lunch, heading back in. Let's see if justice is done. So the prosecutor spent a lot of time mid-morning, coming up before lunch, talking about the finer points of whether or not Kumanjai would have been able to use his right arm to attack the other constable, and whether or not Constable Rolfe was justified in using force. The argument, of course, was that he was not justified once Mr. Walker was on the ground stabilised, with his right arm pinned under his body, with the other constable pushing down on both his hands with his full weight and bracing himself against the floor. 95 kilogram constable on top of Mr. Walker after he'd been shot once, and the argument is that it was unjustified to shoot him again. There was no danger, and if there was danger, then it was dangerous to deploy the weapon given the safety risks for the other constable who was on top of Mr. Walker. In now, nice cool foyer. This is where the Tibetan lamas came and did sand paintings at a gentler time.